And we were finishing up the autonomic nervous system. So sort of just tying up the loose ends, making those large, big picture connections. And so we were speaking about how the regulation of the autonomic function takes place. Essentially how this gets fed into the higher centers, our integrating centers, and they can send responses to increase parasympathetic activity and therefore decrease sympathetic and vice versa. We spoke about this dual innovation, the idea that the heart is being innervated by both divisions of this branch of the nervous system. And so as a part of my resting heart rate, I've got some of that input coming from parasympathetic fibers, some of that influence coming from sympathetic fibers. If I'm running or fighting or fleeing, then I'm going to see more sympathetic influence kind of being toned up by those integrating centers in the brain. But then I'm also likewise going to see less parasympathetic influence, sort of toning that down by those integrating centers in the brain as well. All right. And that's that idea that we spoke about at the beginning, which is called comparative secrecy. So we have to, manipulate or influence both divisions in order to bring about that desired effect, because both of those divisions are innervating all of our effector organs. And so just looking generally here at the functions of each branch of the autonomic nervous system, the parasympathetic, we said, was responsible for quiet, relaxed states. This is the rest and digest. Think about having a large meal, relaxing on the couch, Sunday dinner or Thanksgiving dinner. This is where we see increased gastrointestinal activity. So we shunt blood away from things like our skeletal muscle, away from the heart, and we shunt blood towards the GI organs. We also see salivary secretions increase. We see lacrimal secretions in the eyes increase. This is why when you get tired, you also eyes start watering because of that increased, This is why when you're tired, your eyes sometimes start watering as a part of that increased lacrimal gland secretion. And then all other glands of the GI system, so liver, spleen, pancreas, all of that, they will receive increased input and increased gastrointestinal motility and activity in general. We also see a slowing down of the heart rate, a slowing down or decrease in blood pressure, and a drop in the respiratory rate as well. So just kind of a slowing down of the general body system and more of that resting and digesting state. Alternatively, the sympathetic activity is generating a fight or flight or freeze response. So sometimes we are not in a position to fight physically or run physically. And so the next best thing is to just freeze and kind of play dead. And we see that happening in a lot of other animal species, and humans exhibit that as well. That's usually what you get if you have stage fright or stage terror, where you just freeze and become sort of paralyzed by fear. And that is a part of the sympathetic activity generating that response. So this is elicited during emergency situations, during stressful times, and stress being here, not only physical stress, right, but physiologic stress, emotional stress, mental stress as well. And then exercise can elicit this as well. We see an increase in heart rate, we see an increase in blood pressure. We're shunting blood in the opposite direction. So from our GI organs and to our skeletal muscles, to the heart, to the lungs. We also mobilize energy stores. So we tap into those stores of glucose that are in the muscle, that are in the liver, in the kidneys, and generate some additional glucose to make ATP for that stressful response. As far as the pupils, we see dilation of the pupils. So this is allow for more light to come in so that we can properly surveil our environment and make appropriate decisions. And then we also see a decrease in gastrointestinal and urinary function. So we sometimes lose the ability to hold our urine, so that guarding reflex is a part of the parasympathetic system. And so when we have an override via the sympathetic system, we sometimes can have an accident where we lose that guarding reflex, which would otherwise prevent the voiding of the bladder, right? So these are all some of the things that I'm sure we've heard about or are familiar with in terms of everyday life and being scared or afraid or traumatized. And this is what is, this is the nervous system branch that is eliciting some of those responses. Now, although we've been speaking about both branches as being active, and that is true when we're at rest, right? So heart is receiving input from parasympathetic and sympathetic, we still want to understand and acknowledge that this parasympathetic always slightly predominates. So it's always slightly higher in terms of its input, and that is what allows us to really be at rest. So they're not kind of equal in their contribution the way that we would think, although they're both inputting these organs. In order for us to be at a restful state, the parasympathetic is going to be slightly more dominant than the sympathetic influence. This is just illustrating some of those higher centers that are controlling or regulating the autonomic function. So we've got the cardiovascular centers, which are in pons and medulla. We also have respiratory centers, also located in pons and medulla. And then these are going to be sending or integrating some of those signals that we talked about. So for example, if blood pressure drops in any part of our body, in any part of our vasculature, those signals are sent to these regions in the brain. They can then send the corresponding response on efferent fibers from these signals that would help correct the heart rate, help correct the respiratory rate appropriately. We also have other centers such as the hypothalamus. And so the hypothalamus is pretty much one of the main autonomic regulators. The hypothalamus receives input from other areas of the brain. It's kind of like one of the master, it's one of our master endocrine glands, but also one of our master processing areas in the brain. It can receive information from our prefrontal cortex about thoughts we're having. It can receive information from the limbic system about our emotions. It can receive other information from the amygdala about fear, about memories. And so this is why we also see these types of responses, even if we're not physically in a threatening or a dangerous situation environmentally or physically. But if we have thoughts about that, if we have memories about those types of traumatic or scary or stressful events, we can elicit changes to our respiratory rate and our heart rate because of those inputs coming to the hypothalamus as well. Okay, and so we can sort of leverage this understanding. This is where things like mindfulness come into play, where we can mimic a relaxing situation and really elicit that parasympathetic response. And this is also why, on the flip side, if you're stressed about some non-threatening situation, right, financially, or maybe you're stressed about grades or a bad breakup or something like that, you can also mimic a physically dangerous situation. So your body doesn't understand the difference between a physical, life-threatening, dangerous situation and a minor, non-threatening stressor or stressful event. So it's really important to leverage this understanding clinically, but also in your everyday life, where deep breathing, meditation can mimic the body or trick the body into thinking that more of that parasympathetic experience is happening and will elicit lower body temperatures, lower heart rate, and lower respiratory rate, and kind of calm the body. Okay, so a huge tangent there, but just to explain some of the everyday application of some of that stuff. And the last two slides are really just summary tables. So essentially thinking about each specific body system or organ system here and how that is influenced by the parasympathetic, which is pretty much toning things down, except the GI secretions and such. Whereas we're also comparing what's happening with the sympathetic system, which is pretty much toning things up, again, accepting the digestive tract, the glandular secretions, and so on. Okay. Yeah, and then the receptors that are located with that as well. So kind of a good summary tool. I will not expect you to memorize it this, so don't be too bothered about that. But have a general sense of what is the sympathetic system doing versus what is the parasympathetic system doing.